Right then, good morning all. I'm just going to give you a bit of feedback on the mock that you did last week. So that's the immigration paper, the specimen paper. Before I get on with it, I just want to say really pleased with a lot of you, because I'd say about 95% of the class has managed to significantly improve on the last mock, on the teenagers mock. So really good there to see that progress, and hopefully by the time your exam rolls around, you'll be more than ready to tackle the exam there. Okay, so getting on to question 1 then. So question 1 is this age-old "what's the message of the cartoon?" Sorry, the question there's sideways because I couldn't fit it all in. I'm sure you can read it then. So with this one, again, as I just said, a lot of improvement. Impressed with that. However, there are still things you can do to push yourselves up to the higher levels or the highest level. So I'm just going to have a quick run through the mark scheme and focus on the ways you can push yourself up into the level 4 or the level 5. So for level 3, to get up to level 3, you need to have focused on the main message of the cartoon. Okay, and the main message being that racist opponents of immigration, okay, so we've got these racists here, are stupid, basically. They're fascists, they're idiots, highlighted by the fact that they've misspelt Britain and they've misspelt white. So that's the main message of the source. So if you don't manage to get into that and say the cartoonist is trying to say these people are stupid, then you're not going to get above a level 2. Okay, so you need to really think about what the cartoon is trying to say, what's the purpose of the source. So to get up into a level 4, you need to focus on the main message, obviously, and you need to support your argument with detail from the source, okay, and or rather your own contextual knowledge, okay. And a lot of you did manage to do this, which was good. So you can focus on, again, as I say, the misspelling of white there, the misspelling of Britain. You can focus on the fact that this passerby here, let me sort that out. This passerby here is, making this reference to Hitler, and then you can bring in your own knowledge about, what he's trying to say by that. Basically, you're a bunch of fascists, you're a bunch of racists. Another thing you could focus on is the year, and you could start to talk about Race Relations Act. You could start to talk about, I know it was 9 years before this, but you could talk about Summer of Violence, some of the things there. And there was actually, we haven't looked at it in masses of detail, but there was some anti-discrimination organisations and discussion going on at that time as well. As I say, we haven't looked at that really, but we will look at that at some stage. So to get up into the highest level there, level 5, what you need to do is, it says to put it into context. So you need that main message, you need to have all this detail, focus on all the detail, and then you need to put it into context. Okay, so basically that context, we're talking about what was going on at the time. All right, what was the background to this? Why did the cartoonist draw this cartoon at this time? Okay, and another thing we are going to look at, so you may be saying I haven't given you a good enough chance to answer this question. However, a lot of you have put enough detail in there to warrant 5 and even 6 marks out of 6. But before your exam, I'm going to give you even more detail. And one of the other things you could have looked at, if we'd have gone through it, was the formation of the National Front. Okay, I'm sure some of you know about the National Front and what its ideology was. But as I say, we're going to look at that in more detail. But that's another thing that was going on, and that was actually in 1967. Okay, so that's something else you could have put into your answer to show your knowledge and to back up this argument. Okay, but again, you need to be focusing on the main message of the source. And somebody who did that really well was Mr. Bell. So I'm just going to read a bit of his answer, just to show you what a really good answer looks like. So he says, message of the source is that the racist behaviour shown in Britain in the 1960s was like that of Hitler. The source shows some white men writing on a wall, "Go home blacks, keep Britain white." The fact that white is spelt incorrectly shows the cartoonist, so important point there, the cartoonist believes the people who involve themselves in racist behaviour are imbeciles. That means idiots. So at the time of the source being published, many black Caribbean people were entering the country looking for work. 250,000 people from the Caribbean entered Britain between 1955 and 1962. Really good little fact there. And there was a lot of hate for these immigrants. This was shown by Notting Hill attacks in 1958, and the source shows that people still have similar hatred towards them in 1967. And then he starts to talk about the reliability of the source, which you can do, however, it doesn't, for me, it didn't add anything else to the answer there. I like that answer because it's got some background, some contextual knowledge in it, some good little facts, and he's got the main message of the source, which is these people are stupid. Okay, good. So moving on to question 2 then. So question 2 then. Question 2 is study these two sources and basically say which is more useful in telling you about the feelings of immigrants in Britain. The first thing to note with this is that if you just say that one source is useful because, or not useful because it's from the 1990s, they're recalling a memory, as in source B, or if you say with source C that it's somebody talking about his mother's experience and not actually his experience, then you can only get up to level 2, which is 3 to 4 marks out of 8. So it's worth doing that. However, it's also worth bearing in mind that that will only get you half marks maximum. Okay, so how then do we get up to the higher levels? Well, I think it'll help if you go back to that little guide that I made for you about what to cover in a good answer, because if you go through those steps, then you should be looking at, or you will be looking at, a higher level answer. So what you need to do then is this ATQ, answer the question. Some of you actually didn't do that. Some of you started talking about reliability instead of usefulness, or not using the right language. So you need to use the exact language, the keywords from the question. So this source is more useful, this source is useful to some extent. So that's the first thing you need to do. Remember, you need to try and do that at the beginning and the end. You can also, as I've said already, use the provenance, so that's the origin, where it came from, and consider the purpose if there is any. I'm not sure if there is with these two, and then discuss the reliability. So if you're looking at the provenance and the reliability, as I say, that's going to get you to level 2. Then what you need to do is you need to find at least one aspect, if not 2, in each source that you can put your own knowledge onto. Alright, and the best answers I read did do this. Okay, so you're trying to suggest, or you're trying to say to the examiner, I know that this is true. So for example, I know that some people faced discrimination, as it says in source B. Okay, she says there, so you could pick out my feelings of pride and love were beaten down again and again by racism. I know this because the for example, Notting Hill riots in the 50s, or just general discrimination in jobs and housing. Okay, but you could also say, from the first sentence here, I was in love with Britain. You could say, well, I know that Caribbean immigrants quite often saw Britain as the motherland, and that's why they came. And then it was only once they got here that they faced this prejudice and discrimination. So from that, from saying, I know that this is true and this is true, you could say source B is therefore quite useful. In terms of source C, what you can say about source C is that, of course, some people did have positive experiences, because we can't generalise, as we always have to say. So that, that therefore potentially makes it useful, because we know that there were different experiences for immigrants coming to Britain. However, what I really liked in some answers was people commenting on the fact that because it was, a little boy, we presume, seeing his mum and how she was acting, it could be just that she was putting on a brave face. All right, so therefore, you're getting deep into that source and you're questioning its usefulness, because a lad's experience, seeing his mum and how she coped in a new country in Britain. She's not necessarily going to come home and break down crying every night. She's going to put on a brave face for her son. So that's really interesting. I like that. It's not in the mark scheme, however, I gave extra marks for that, and I'm sure an examiner would too. So that's basically how you get up into 7 and 8 marks. So for level 4 it says evaluates the usefulness of one source based on contextual knowledge, that's your own knowledge, supported by detail from the source. And for level 5 it's saying you're comparing the usefulness of both sources by evaluating them in context, supported by detail from both sources. So to simplify that, all that means really is you're breaking down aspects of the source and you're considering it from a different point of view, and then you're hooking your own knowledge onto it, onto specific parts of each source. So that's how you're going to get up into the level 4s and the level 5s. Okay, so question 3. How far do you trust this source? Use details of the leaflet and your own knowledge to explain your answer. I think this is quite an interesting one and quite a good question. My main gripe, I guess, would be some people didn't read the provenance carefully enough. Okay, so it's a British government leaflet published in India in 1958. So if you didn't read the provenance carefully enough, then quite often your answer wasn't right, basically. I mean, I gave marks for the argument that was developed, but I can't give many more than that. However, if you read the provenance correctly, most of you did manage to come up with some good stuff. And I'm going to begin by reading a particular answer that I thought was quite good. So it's Anya, actually. She says, I do not trust the source because it is an exaggerated description of the situation in Britain aimed to reduce the rate of immigration in Britain. Really good opening sentence there. Okay, so she's used the language from the source, from the question rather. So she's already starting to answer the question there, and she's summed up exactly what the purpose of this leaflet was, and she said it's exaggerated. Okay. She then says it tells you that although Chandra Lal was encouraged by the positive outlook of Britain, he came to Britain only to find unemployment until finding an unappealing labouring job. It also tells you that Chandra Lal was one of the lucky ones. So she's picked out there that particular sentence, or part of the sentence, one of the lucky ones. As many Indian and Pakistanis were unemployed. During the 1950s, the rate of immigration, so here we've got the specific contextual knowledge, rate of immigration from countries like India and Pakistan increased due to Britain wanting employees to help work in the new NHS, London transport system, and help rebuild Britain after the war. Okay, so there's nothing particularly detailed in that contextual knowledge, but it's accurate and it's relevant. Alright, so she's using that knowledge there to back up her argument. So then she goes on to say, however, then immigrants receive racial tension. Many British people accused immigrants of stealing their jobs. This shows the leaflet is exaggerating the situation of employment for immigrants in Britain in order to please the British public and reduce the amount of immigrant workers. Therefore, it is not factually correct. So, in a conclusion there, I've given a 6 out of 7, and the reason for that is because in a conclusion she doesn't then use the same language from the question. So if she'd have said, this is why I don't trust the source, because it is, she summed it all up again, because it is propaganda pretty much aimed at reducing immigration, then she probably would have got 8 marks. So to sum up, it's the same old story really. You need specific contextual knowledge, not just whatever you fancy saying at that particular moment. It has to be specific, related to the question, so specific contextual knowledge, and you need to pick out details from the source, as Anya has done, and link your own knowledge onto that. Question 4 then. So you've got to study both these sources, one being a photo, the other being an account from a Pakistani immigrant from the 60s, and it's asking you which you think gives a more accurate view of the reception given to immigrants. So this is actually quite similar to question 2 in some ways, and again, it was quite well answered, but there were issues, and one of the issues was the same as with question 2, was if you're just talking about the type of source, so you're saying it's a photograph, okay, or it's an account from the 80s, then you're only going to get up to 3 or 4 marks out of 9. Okay, so this is out of 9. So what you need to do to get up to that highest level, the higher levels, is you need to evaluate the accuracy by using your own contextual knowledge, or you can cross-reference with other sources. Remember, we said we can do that. We can cross-reference with other sources in the paper, and supported by details from within the source. And to get up to the highest level, you have to compare the accuracy of both sources by evaluating them in context and supported by detail from the sources. Alright, so if you only evaluate one, then you can actually get up to about 6 marks, but if you start evaluating both of them, then that's going to get your highest marks. There were a couple of really good answers. One was Byron's and one was Susie's, and I've chosen Susie's to read a bit from, simply because there's a really nice phrase in it that I like, that sums up what I think, the sort of things you should be including, you should be saying in a question of this type. So what she says is, source E shows West Indian immigrants arriving at Waterloo Station and being welcomed by white British people holding signs saying welcome to Britain. This source comes from a journalist and will therefore have been taken for a purpose. Alright, so I really like that. Nobody else said that really, at least not in those words. Alright, but that adequately sums it all up. Straight away she's saying this picture, okay, this picture here will have been taken for a purpose. And straight away, that's going to affect the accuracy of the source, isn't it? So she then goes on to say what the purpose is. So to maybe make people think that there wasn't an issue of racism. Okay, so I really like that sentence. This source comes from a journalist and will therefore have been taken for a purpose to maybe make people think that there wasn't an issue of racism in Britain. So that's really good, because that does say, well, maybe we can't trust the accuracy of that source fully. She then goes on to say source F shows that people who arrived were given manual jobs instead of better paid jobs they were qualified for. It says that the immigrants could work better than their bosses but wouldn't get work as anything more than a manual labourer. And she says she's summed up that source, which you should do maybe a little more briefly than that, but that's fine. She then goes on to add a bit of her own knowledge, saying that I think source F gives us a more accurate view of the reception immigrants got, as I know that immigrants were often discriminated against in the workplace and that they were given the jobs that require little qualifications when they were actually capable of much more. Also, source F is reliable as it comes from a real person who witnessed what it was actually like. Right, so just at the end there, she's thrown in the fact that we can trust it because, or it's accurate because it is one person's experience. So the only thing she could have done there perhaps would be more contextual knowledge. Okay, but the way she set out that question, that answer, and the stuff within it, the language used in it, is that's what's pushed her up to a perfect answer for me. So the sort of thing she could say, just taken from Byron's answer now. So he's talked about the 1948 National Immigration Act, which I presume he means British Nationalities Act. However, an examiner probably wouldn't hold that against you, they'd know what you're on about. So he said 1948 British Nationalities Act introduced London transport workers, and in the NHS they came to fill menial jobs that were left. And for source F, he's talked about Summer of Violence 1958. Okay, so that's taking Susie's answer, which is really nicely worded, and then adding a bit of contextual knowledge there from Byron's answer. Okay, so second to last question, question 5. Are you surprised that this photograph was published in 1968? So use details of the photograph and your knowledge to explain your answer, as always. It's quite a famous photograph, actually, this one. Quite often used when discussing the Rivers of Blood speech and its impact. What I'm going to do, I'm going to return to Ollie Bell, because he's had a bit of a stormer, to be honest, and I'm just going to I'll probably read most of his answer, because it's about 7 out of 8. So he says, I'm not surprised Source G was published in 1968. This is because it was shortly after Enoch Powell delivered his Rivers of Blood speech. The speech involved Powell expressing his views on the country's situation with immigration, which were viewed by many as racist. The picture in the newspaper is trying to show, so he's looking at the purpose now, many people agreed with Powell's speech and that black people were surrounded by racist views. The newspaper is trying to go against Powell, so he's still on the purpose, which is good, as it shows a black man having to walk past a message on a wall that is targeted at him. However, this source is unreliable as it's likely to be staged. Alright, he's making a bit of a leap there, but yeah, he might be right, because the chances that a black man is walking past the wall at this time is very unlikely. The speech that Powell made led him to being kicked out of his position, a bit of contextual knowledge there, and led to the Race Relations Act being passed. This made racism in public places illegal. However, it was difficult to enforce, as it's easier to change the law than people's views. Alright, nice little phrase there, easier to change the law than people's views. So what he's got there is he's got a bit of surprised, or not surprised by the picture being published, and he's saying why. He's backing it up with his own contextual knowledge about the Rivers of Blood speech, and he's considering the purpose of the newspaper. Right? Why would the newspaper have published it at this time? Probably because they were showing how much racism there was in England, which is exactly what Ollie said. The thing he could have done for full marks is then go on to say that he wasn't surprised as well. Sorry, that he was surprised. Alright, and the way he could have done this would be by saying that he was surprised because publishing this picture in the paper at the time may have been insensitive. Okay, so he could be questioning then the newspaper and why they would do that. So it does exist. Someone has actually painted this on the wall, but should a newspaper then go and print that picture, or should they have just let it be? Final thing on this question then, you need to say why. Alright, so as Ollie's done, you need to say why you're surprised or why you're not surprised. So you can't just say, I am surprised by this picture. You need to back it up, you need to say exactly why. Okay? Generally, pretty well answered question though. Alright, final question. So this is the big one. And I'm glad that a lot of you managed to get onto this, because I think that's part of the reason why your marks have improved. Okay? It's bumped up a lot of marks there, because, as I said, while you're actually doing the mock, it is quite easy to get up into the higher levels. Alright, so what it says on the mark scheme is a balanced argument, a balanced answer using relevant contextual knowledge unsupported from the sources would be 4 to 5 marks. So even if you don't use the sources, then you're going to get up to 4 to 5 marks. To get up to 6 to 7 marks, you can have a one-sided answer with specific detailed support from the sources. Alright, so you're not arguing a balanced, your answer is not balanced, it's one-sided, but you're at least using the sources. And then to get up to 8 marks, which a lot of you did, all you need to do is have a balanced answer with specific detail from the sources. And if you've only used one source from each side, then you're going to get the lowest within that bracket, so that's 8 marks. But then if you use more sources, then you're going to get more marks, as long as you've evaluated and analysed them. Right, so if you just describe them again, then of course you're not going to get in the top bracket there. And for the top level, 11 to 12 marks, you need to say how far. Alright, this is something that I do want to look at a little more. The language to use. How do you say how far, or to what extent? Because even the best answers weren't perfect. They didn't conclude, didn't sum it up nicely. Some of them did, but a lot of them, they didn't quite get to it. Didn't quite say to this extent. So I've just included a little guide here for you as to how to answer this question. Obviously, you need an introduction. So there's a bit of a sentence for you. The sources and my knowledge suggest that this statement in this question is partly right, but there are other points of view to consider as well. These sources support the statement, while these sources do not. Okay, so that's a nice way of starting your essay, because that's basically what it is. It's an essay. So that's another thing. Actually, you do need paragraphs. Some of you weren't. It wasn't clear where one paragraph ended and another one started, so you need to make sure that you're clearly showing, this is my introduction, this is my agreement paragraph, this is my disagreement paragraph, and this is my conclusion. Alright, so you need at least 3 paragraphs in there. So, agreement paragraph sources X, Y, and Z support the view of these statements. So, point, example, explain. Okay, I know you use this in English. So you make your point, you give an example, and then you explain why that agrees with what you're trying to say. And another thing you can add to the end of that, so instead of just P, you can have peel. Alright, so you can have point, evidence, or example, explain, and then link. Alright, so you're linking it back to the question. Alright, so if you do that for each one, then you definitely, that's basically where the analysis comes from. That's where you start to analyse it. Alright, so agreement. However, we should also remember that this is reliable, unreliable, so then you're talking about the provenance, the purpose, and the reliability, or as it says there, knowledge, origin, nature, and purpose. Same thing though. Then disagreement, and then however again, reliability, then your conclusion. So, a nice little sentence. So, having weighed up the evidence, this essay concludes, or I conclude, that the sources support this statement more or less than they do not support it, because this source, so you could choose 1 or 2 sources saying, I think these sources are stronger sources, and that's why they back up my argument, or they disprove the statement. Okay, so for this one, British welcomed immigrants in the 1950s and 60s. You know, you're going to look for sources, obviously, that back it up and sources that disagree with it, and then it's up to you to make that decision about which sources are the stronger ones, and that will then decide your conclusion, decide your argument. Okay, and it says there, hot tips: start each paragraph clearly, use 2 paragraphs. So this is basically just what I've said, one for each side of the argument, and use at least 2 sources to support each side of the argument, and show awareness that some sources are more reliable than others. Alright, so that's basically just summing up what I've said and everything within that little guide there. Okay, so there were some really good answers, but we're going to look at some good language to use for conclusions, and trying to get this point across of how far, to what extent. So one conclusion I particularly liked was Dan's. He said, whilst there are 1 or 2 pieces of evidence which would suggest that immigrants were welcomed into Britain, the majority of the sources and my own contextual knowledge suggest otherwise, especially after such events as the Summer of Violence and the Rivers of Blood, where Britain's distaste to immigrants was demonstrated. That's a really nice conclusion, really nice way of summing it up. The only thing he could have done there is mention again a couple of the sources and say this source shows it, this one does, and they are reliable and they are, you know, better sources than the others. That's the only way he could have improved on that. Okay. So really well done again to pretty much all of you for at least making an improvement on your last score. Just a last little tip, a last little idea. It might be worth, in fact it probably is worth, when you go into the exam, when you open your paper, just have a quick flick through the sources and just start circling stuff, like whatever you see. Think about stuff you can link your own knowledge to, like circle years, circle, you know, the fact that that's a spelling mistake, circle Hitler, and then from there you can start your answer, right? So British government leaflet, you're looking at the provenance. 1958, what's the relevance of that? Okay, emotive language, cold wind bit through his thin cotton clothing. Powell, who's he? Alright, 1968, what's the relevance? Okay, what does PM mean? Alright, so it might be worth just going through and circling, underlining, picking out bits from the sources, and from there, you know, that's what you can build your answer on. Okay.